there's still aspects that we don't know much about. We don't know, like we don't really understand the difference between politeness and compassion. We know that liberals are more compassionate than conservatives, and conservatives are more polite than liberals. And we think that politeness is somehow associated with the tendency of conservatives to follow social rules. But that's about, I would say that's about all we know. Now, we don't even know how much difference there will turn out to be between politeness and compassion. But there are ongoing studies trying to understand the covariates and correlates of the aspects. And the same is true of the traits. There was a lot of argument about openness when it first was discovered statistically. Some people, like Hans Eysenck, who formulated some of the early three-dimensional models of personality, and that was extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism, which he thought would predict the proclivity towards schizophrenia, but actually turned out to be composed of low agreeableness and low conscientiousness. Eysenck didn't even think that openness was a reasonable trait. He thought it was mostly captured by IQ. And actually that seems to be the case to some degree, because if you divide openness into intellect and into openness to experience, it looks like IQ loads on intellect, or at least the nonverbal part of IQ loads on intellect, where the verbal part of IQ tends to load more on openness, and so does openness to experience, and so does creativity. But this is all discovered after the fact. So, now one of the things that's happened as a consequence of parsing out personality into the big 5 traits, and also using other trait schemas, is that it's quite clear that there are differences between the sexes, or if you like, differences between the genders. Now, this is a thorny problem, and it's thorny for a number of reasons. One reason is that it's a dogmatic assumption, proposition of social constructionists that gender differences are socially constructed. First of all, they separate out the idea of sex, which you could think of as biological sex. You could think of as chromosomal sex, I presume. That's one thing, but gender, that's a whole different thing. And gender is the manner in which men and women present themselves to the world in terms of differences in, well, anything that you can measure that's above the fundamentally biological level. Maybe you could say anything above the chromosomal difference. Like, I don't exactly know where the distinction is supposed to be made between biological sex and gender. It's not a simple thing to understand. But the proposition still obtains that if there are differences between men and women at the level of phenotypic manifestation, then they're socially constructed. The problem with that is that it seems to be wrong. And not just a little bit wrong, but wrong right to the core. And one of the things that I would like to propose to you is that the social constructionists only have theory on their side. I don't believe they have any data to support their claims whatsoever. Now, I also think that they wouldn't accept the sorts of things that I'm going to talk to you about as data. But that's a whole different argument. I don't really understand how it's possible for people in the modern world to reject scientific claims, given that almost everything they do in their day-to-day life that has anything to do with technology whatsoever depends for its function on the validity of the scientific theories that underpin the technology. So what that means is that people who treat scientific data as if it's just another form of information, socially constructed information, certainly don't behave like that if you follow them around in the actual world. Now, here's a proposition about agreeableness. I don't know if this is the case, because as I said, there's lots of things we don't understand about the big 5 dimensions. But this is how I've worked it out for my own understanding, and it's in accordance with the data insofar as I can determine that. Agreeableness seems to be the dimension between, we certainly know agreeable people are empathic and compassionate and polite. We know less about disagreeable people, although we know that they're more likely to be male. Now, you could associate being disagreeable with being more callous and more harsh and more selfish, in that if you had to bargain with someone who's low in agreeableness, they would fight harder for their side of the equation than someone high in agreeableness would fight for theirs. Now, there's a couple of things about human beings that aren't considered sufficiently, I believe, insofar as we conceptualize human personality. And one is that humans are unbelievably maternal, both genders. They have to be, because our babies are born. For a mammal of our size, the gestation period should be 2 years, not 9 months. And so what that means is that babies, human babies, are really born premature. And you can tell that because, you know, like ungulates, deer, I think deer's an ungulate, doesn't matter. Pretty much as soon as they're born, they can stagger up on their legs and start to run around. Whereas a human baby isn't doing that till 15 months or 13 months or 17 months, or depending on the baby. You know, so, and babies are pretty much completely helpless at birth. And so they need a tremendous amount of care. And then because we have such a large cortex, and because we're so behaviorally plastic, we have an extraordinarily long dependence and development period. You know, it's a minimum, it depends on the culture, but it's a minimum of 13 years, and it can certainly extend far beyond that, and does in cultures where there's a tremendous amount of inculcation of information. So, we also know that maternal behavior is very common among mammals. I mean, the very definition of mammal in some sense has to do with maternal behavior, because mammals, well, they bear live young and they produce milk, but they're warm-blooded, and there's some other characteristics. So the ability to care for helpless, frequently upset, dependent creatures for a very long period of time is part of our behavioral repertoire. Now then you might wonder, are there individual differences in the degree to which people are maternal? And I think that's captured at least in part with agreeableness. It makes sense, because on the positive pole of agreeableness, that's where you get warmth and compassion and empathy and the desire to care for others and self-sacrifice, I would say. One of the things we'll show later is that agreeableness is negatively correlated with income, which is exactly what you'd expect if you were negotiating with someone who was self-sacrificing, because they're not going to put forward their side of the power equation as forcefully as someone who is disagreeable. So, but you know, in order to raise a baby, you have to be self-sacrificing. There's no two ways about it. You might find that rewarding and worthwhile, but I don't believe there is a parent who actually becomes a good parent who doesn't put their child's welfare first, and I think that's particularly true of mothers, particularly in the first year after birth. It's probably true right up to the age of 3, but I think it's virtually undeniably true for the first year.